The roll call will go on and on and on. Give thanks, won't you, for the spiritual cedars, for the nurse logs, for those who nurtured us in the faith and those who continue to inspire us. Give thanks for all the saints. At Cape Perpetua, which is in Oregon, in an old growth forest, there is a giant spruce tree that's 200 feet tall and that started to grow about the time of the Protestant Reformation. What's really fascinating about this tree, and it's called the heritage tree, what's really fascinating about this tree is that there's a tunnel that's about 3 feet in diameter that runs through the base of the tree, making it appear that the tree is standing or rooted into the ground on a tripod. Okay, you can picture that. The root system, often stretching 4 to 6 feet above the ground, appears as finger-like extensions that claw the ground in an arch, creating formations that look like mossy buttresses. The tunnel, that empty space running through the root fingers, is the space where a nurse log once was located. This giant spruce began life as a seedling on a nurse log. So nurse logs were once giant trees themselves. Then they died and fell to the earth, and over their barky surface, a mat of sword ferns and lichens, mushrooms, mosses, and fungi began to develop. The log became a nursery for an entirely new ecosystem of life. They also became reservoirs of moisture, since the rotting surface of the nurse log retains water like a sponge. With the nurse log down on the forest floor, light as well as rain now streams through that opening in the forest canopy. In such a high moisture environment, the nurse log decays, and soon the seeds of mighty trees, caught in the mossy layer that now grows on its surface, they sprout and take root. As they grow larger, their roots will surround the girth of the nurse log, and the tree will shoot up and take its place in the forest. Soon, strong and viable on its own, the tree stands alone, and the nurse log, utterly decomposed, has disappeared. Saints are like that. Saints are folks who, in life and death, occupy a significant place in the church. In life, their roots were planted deep, and they were well watered, and their lives bore fruit of faithfulness. Then in death, they became soil and nutrients for seedling saints that followed and would someday become giants themselves. Since arriving at College Heights, there are names that have been spoken with great respect and love and fondness. They are remembered frequently and often enough for me to know that indeed they must have been some of the nurse logs for you. Nurse logs that gave life to many in this church. They include Charles and Ruth Thrift, Foster Heath, Charles and Charlene Green, Odie Bly, Charlotte Hedberg, former pastors Reverend Charlie Hamilton, and Reverend Eldon Sims. Their lives continued to provide a nursery environment for those following after them, the ones who came looking for light and water and places to send down roots. Their gifts continue to sustain life and faith in the church, and they continue to nurture saints in the making. Whenever you make a list, invariably you leave some off, someone out that others would have included. So long-timers, I invite you in the moment to add those names to the list that you would have made. I also know that those named and called to mind are only the more recent nurse trees. Many others preceded them, and their stories are told in our history book. And now I want to tell you the story of another kind of saint, but before I do, I want us to listen to Luke 6:37 through 38. Do not judge, and you will not be judged. Do not condemn, and you will not be condemned. Forgive, and you will be forgiven. Give, and it will be given to you. A good measure, pressed down, shaken together, running over, will be put into your lap. For the measure you give will be the measure you get back. There are saints that live on the edges of the church. They are not the ones here most Sundays or even many Sundays, yet their lives express a love that is beyond human love. They bear witness to the nurse logs that influenced their lives. This is a saint I came to know in another church. And as I share the story, I remind us all that we are all saint and sinner. We are both saint and sinner. Do not judge, and you will not be judged. Do not condemn, and you will not be condemned. This saint lived most of his life on the edges of the church. He came to church as a child with his parents, maybe only during the Christmas and Easter seasons, and later on, he would on occasion come to church with friends. His name was Dalton Cobb, nicknamed Cobby. For most of his life, Cobby drank too much. It started simply, just one of those things that young teenage boys often do for a while, but for Cobby and for some of his buddies, that drinking hung on longer than just those rebellious teen years. When Cobby was growing up, his father, Hoke Cobb, donated a cedar tree to the church every year at Christmas. He always cut a very large tree that reached the ceiling of that little wood frame sanctuary. When Cobby was old enough, he began to help his father with this annual gift to the church, and he took over the task when his father died. That tradition continued for a time after the church built their new sanctuary, and then one year, Cobby even gave the gift of a living cedar tree. Someone thought that a tree would look nice planted on the corner of the church property where they had just finished building their new fellowship hall. The tree still stands today and has been a favorite climbing tree for children throughout the years. Cobby gave up drinking a few years before he passed away, which was in 2003. And he quit drinking for love. He did it to win the heart of a woman named Elizabeth, and it worked. Cobby and Elizabeth were the first couple that I ever married. Last Sunday in the sermon, we had olive trees, right? You remember olive trees grafted with wild olive branches. This Sunday, I share with you nurse logs and now cedar trees. Cedars of Lebanon are often referenced in Scripture. And so I wanted to read a description from Scripture of a particularly grand cedar of Lebanon. This is from Ezekiel 31. A cedar of Lebanon with fair branches and forest shade, and of great height, its top among the clouds. The waters nourished it, the deep made it grow tall, making its rivers flow around the place it was planted, sending forth its streams to all the trees of the field. So it towered high above all the trees of the field. Its boughs grew large and its branches long, from abundant water in its shoots. All the birds of the air made their nests in its boughs, and under its branches all the animals of the field gave birth to their young. And in its shade all great nations lived. It was beautiful in its greatness, in the length of its branches, for its roots went down to abundant water. The cedars in the garden of God could not rival it, nor the fir trees equal its boughs. The plane trees were as nothing compared with its branches. No tree in the garden of God was like it in beauty. So my question is, what makes someone, a family even, on the edges of the church, give gifts to the church? Why did the Cobb family donate the time and the energy and the gift of a fresh cedar tree every Christmas? And why did Cobby continue that tradition and later donate a living cedar tree for the landscape at the church? I think it's partly due to nurse logs again. Cobby's maternal grandmother, it turns out, was a faithful, active Christian woman. Maybe her life's testimony to her children and grandchildren was that we return something of what we have been given back to God. Cobby's mother, though not regular in her church attendance, was a person of faith. And who knows what seeds of faith she planted and nurtured in Cobby. I want to share one more part of Cobby's story. Years before Cobby died, before he quit drinking, and before he got married, Cobby drafted his last will and testament. Cobby gave 10% of his estate to the church. Now think about that. The church has a hard enough time getting folks who regularly come to church to tithe. And here is someone on the edges of church life that knew the importance of giving back. Later in that same chapter in Ezekiel, that cedar tree is cut down. Now, there is a lot more to the context of this particular cedar tree story that's in Ezekiel, and you can read about it or research about it, but for today, I just want us to hear about the cedar tree on its own. So this is later in that chapter, verses 12 and 13. Foreigners from the most terrible of the nations have cut it down and left it. On the mountains and in all the valleys, its branches have fallen, and its boughs lie broken in all the watercourses of the land. And all the peoples of the earth went away from its shade and left it. On its fallen trunk settle all the birds of the air, and among its boughs lodge all the wild animals. Sounds like the making of a nurse log. This church, and really maybe every church, has a legacy of spiritual cedars who became nurse logs for many of us. Some are saints who, like Cobby, were on the edges of the church, literally. Some are saints memorialized in our stained glass windows. They're named on brass plaques on our pews. Their names are in our hymnals and Bibles in the pew. I named some of this church's spiritual cedars at the beginning of this sermon. They already inhabited heavenly places when I got here. Their names echoed in these walls, and their stories graced your lips. Some of our newer spiritual seeders have died since I was appointed here. Carl and Betty Dix, Bev Daniel, Marty McGonigal, Sue Fee, Tilly Brooks, Marcella Palm, Bob Beswick, Deanie Garrett. The list could go on, and it does. I'm sure you're adding to it in your mind and in your heart. In a few moments, we will name the saints we lost this year. Spiritual seeders, nurse logs. And then there are saints alive, those still living and growing among us, those who continue their gifts of sharing their time, talents, their service, skills, money. You continue to inspire and encourage one another. You are there for the spiritual, the cedar saintlings in the making. People like, and you make the list. The list, the roll call will go on and on and on. Give thanks, won't you, for the spiritual cedars, for the nurse logs, for those who nurtured us in the faith, and those who continue to inspire us. Give thanks for all the saints.